What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. This is normally where I'd give you the weekly rundown on a handful of stories, but today I wanted to focus on this, Starship's 13th test flight out of Starbase, Texas. I want to get into the numbers of this spaceship and why this test specifically was such a big deal. So let's get into it. Thanks for watching. So the first thing that I want to get into is just how big this rocket is actually, and the scale on this thing is massive. Fully stacked, the rocket plus the booster stands at 408 feet tall, 124 meters. That's taller than the Statue of Liberty, including its pedestal. So to start out, the bottom half of the rocket is called Super Heavy, and it's the booster. It has 33 individual Raptor 3 engines, and together that puts out about 18 million pounds of thrust. And for reference, the Saturn V rocket had only 7.5 million. So bar none, this is the most powerful rocket ever produced. And then the top half is the ship itself, Starship proper. And it has 6 engines of its own. It has 3 built for operation in the vacuum of space or for orbit, and then it has 3 built for sea level operations. This is the part of the ship that will contain its payload or potentially a crew. And the neat thing about Starship is that both components, both the ship and the booster, have the capability to be reused. In this specific test, they weren't trying to catch and reuse the booster. They did a soft landing in the ocean outside of Starbase, Texas, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Now, why does this specific test flight matter? This wasn't just SpaceX saying, oh, let's launch another rocket again. No, this was the second test flight ever of the Starship V3. The first test flight for V3 was back in May, and all that did was prove that the rocket could fly. SpaceX had specific objectives for this test flight, including higher pressure on the ship itself and trying to deploy a payload, which specifically was the version 3 of their new Starlink satellite. So in a lot of ways, this was SpaceX trying to stress test the Starship to prove that it could handle it further down the line. And then the second thing that they wanted to do was to carry 20 V3 version of their Starlink satellites. And the cool thing about this is that 6 of them were fitted with cameras so that engineers at SpaceX could take a look at the heat shields that are on the outside of the Starship while, those satellites were being deployed. The key difference here is that back in May, during the first test flight of the V3 Starship, these satellites weren't actually deployable satellites. It was just weight simulators sort of shaped like satellites. So this time they had real payload that they were deploying and will prove useful to SpaceX and Starlink. And then finally, the last objective was probably the coolest. The booster itself from Starship intended to flip around, do a boost back burn towards a splashdown area in the Gulf of Mexico. They didn't want to try to catch it this time, but they were trying to do a final control burn right at the end as it was approaching the water and try to do a soft splashdown. But we'll get into more on that later. But the road to get this launch off was sort of a story on its own. Last Thursday, July 16th, right at ignition, T-0, 4 of the Super Heavy's 33 Raptor 3 engines failed. So the system automatically pulled the plug on the launch, and we had to wait until this week. So we fast forward to this Thursday, July 23rd, and the launch was scrubbed again, this time due to weather. Nothing went wrong. SpaceX just decided to pull the plug sometime Thursday afternoon. The conditions weren't right. It was super overcast, a little rain coming down, and they just decided to wait until Friday so they could have a clear picture, clear skies. And then finally, yesterday on Friday, July 24th, liftoff finally came at 6:51 p.m. All 33 Raptor 3 engines launched. They had ended up replacing 2 of the 4 that had failed last week. The cool thing about it is that Starship can actually launch with up to 2 failed engines. 3 or more and they pull the plug, but this time all 33 fired and liftoff was a go. And then here's where I want to slow down for a little bit. About a minute into any rocket launch, there's a moment called max Q, which means maximum dynamic pressure on the rocket itself, right? As the rocket's going to go up, it's going to keep going faster and faster, but the air is also going to keep getting thinner and thinner. Max Q is the moment where those two forces sort of cross over and the pressure is at a maximum on the rocket. So this is sort of like the max stress that the rocket's going to experience. And it's one of the most punishing moments for a ship itself during launch. And again, SpaceX did this on purpose. They wanted to stress test Starship. They wanted to see how the version 3 of the rocket would do, and engineers wanted to take a look at sort of the numbers that they would get back on this launch. The great thing about it is, though, Starship flew right through max Q, no issues whatsoever. And then it was time for the booster separation from Starship proper. There's a brief moment where both the Starship proper itself and the booster, Super Heavy, fire both of their rockets at the same time. After that, Super Heavy, the booster, will fire its rockets and head back down towards the Gulf of Mexico. And there's a small asterisk on how this performed yesterday. The flip back and boost back burn all performed great. 13 planned engines fired for the booster. However, right as it was approaching the water, the commentators on the Starship launch even said that they weren't able to confirm that all of the engines fired as planned. So instead of doing what SpaceX was calling a soft splashdown, they actually had what they called a hard splashdown. The Starship landed where they wanted it to land, no issues there. I think it was maybe like 6 or 7 of the engines fired for the booster as it was landing, but definitely wasn't as soft as they had planned it to be, just a little bit more of an impact into the ocean. And then for the ship itself, it had nearly a perfect flight. All 6 of its engines, remember the 3 sea level and the 3 vacuum optimized engines, ran clean the entire time, no issues. One little side quest that SpaceX was able to accomplish this test flight was, while the ship was in the vacuum of space, they were able to kill and relight one of the Raptor 3 engines on the Starship itself. Being able to shut an engine off and fire it back up while in the vacuum of space is crucial for future missions. Any ship that needs to change its trajectory at all will need to be able to do this. So them being able to accomplish this while in the vacuum of space on this test flight was a huge success. And remember those 20 satellites that Starship was hoping to deploy this flight? All 20 went off without a hitch. Even the 6 with cameras got their shots. Elon even commented on the data that they were able to gather and how incredible that the heat shields held up. And then for the grand finale, when the Starship came in for its own splashdown way out in the Indian Ocean, after circling nearly half the globe, SpaceX said that it was the softest landing that a Starship has ever achieved. So after 2 delays to even get off the ground, the Starship's 13th test flight executed a picture-perfect launch, a perfect boost back burn, a perfect landing in the Indian Ocean. Only one caveat was that the booster came in a little hard in its own landing. But overall, a great success for SpaceX and a wonderful news for those Starship fans of us. And thanks again for watching. Stay tuned for my weekly video where I give a rundown of all the top events in space and space travel and what's transpired over the past week so you don't have to. That'll be out in a few days, so stay tuned.